recording. Okay, thanks for joining us today. I am Ying from SG Tech, and welcome to our series on Go Global series on ASEAN. So today we have this event is jointly organized together with Orisa International, as well as supported by our payment solution partner, Western Union Business Solution. So Indonesia is Southeast Asia's largest country and also ASEAN's most populous one. The relatively young population of 260 million represents both a sizable workforce and also a big pool of consumers. So this is complemented by the country's steady economic growth over the years. So these strong fundamentals make Indonesia one of ASEAN's most attractive investment locations. As with the rest of the world, COVID-19 has pushed forth an accelerated digital adoption, democratizing technology and also driving adoptions of digital habits. So today's session will provide more market information and also potential opportunities in Indonesia for everyone. Before we begin, I would just like to highlight some house rules. So a gentle reminder that this webinar will be recorded for marketing and archival purposes. So the recording will also be uploaded onto SG Tech's website. You can also type your questions in the Q&A box in the Zoom settings throughout the session. So we'll select questions to be answered at the end after all the speakers have presented. So to increase the chances of your question being answered, please ask your questions clearly and also state your company name as well as your name so that we can identify who you are and answer a more tailored question. In the event that the session overruns, we will be happy to link you up with the speakers directly so that if you have any further questions, you can also connect with them. Yep. So very excited to welcome our panel of speakers today. We have three speakers. Mr. Blias Tan, Regional Director from Enterprise Singapore. He's based in Jakarta. He'll be covering the economic overview of Indonesia. And we have Mr. Terence Oh, Director of Dealing Asia, Western Union Business Solutions. He's covering the ICT and digital landscape in Indonesia. And lastly, we have Mr. Omer Wilson, VP Marketing, APAC of Digital Realty. So he'll be covering opportunities in Indonesia's IT sector. All right. So first up, we would like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Blias Tan. He's the Regional Director for Jakarta, and he's also familiar with the food services sector, having spent some years developing the food scene in Singapore. So prior to joining ESG, he was also the Business Development Manager covering Southeast Asia for Klook. So let's welcome Blias, please.
Hello, hi, thanks Ying for the kind introduction. Ying, I think you have to give me the sharing rights so I can share the screen. Okay, yeah, got it. Okay, able to see my screen now?
Perfect.
All right, that's great. Yeah, so thanks very much actually SG Tech for actually organizing this as well. And I think I'm really excited to actually be here today. In fact, actually also being excited because Indonesia itself is actually a very beautiful country. And it's actually at its early frontiers of growth. So there's actually quite a number of opportunities over here. And I'm actually here to provide a very broad economic overview of Indonesia. And this also perhaps actually sets the stage and also the macroeconomic perspective of Indonesia itself. And I'm sure the other speakers will delve deeper into the tech sector. So just to give a very quick introduction of a background of Enterprise Singapore. So Enterprise Singapore, we're actually a government agency under the Ministry of Trade and Industry. So what we actually do is that we actually help Singapore companies to internationalize. We bring Singapore companies out into the region. And as you can see, we also have other counterparts like EDB, JTC, as well as A-Star, that's also under the Ministry of Trade and Industry. So our mission in Enterprise Singapore is to grow stronger Singapore enterprises by building capabilities and accessing global opportunities. What we have actually been doing under our overseas centers is actually to connect Singapore companies with Indonesian companies and to foster any potential business collaborations as well. And our vision is actually to provide a vibrant economy with globally competitive Singapore enterprises. So if you actually take a look in terms of our global network, we're actually quite well covered actually across the different parts of the world. We actually have 36 offices globally. And in Indonesia, we actually have both Jakarta and Surabaya offices. And each actually covers different parts of Indonesia. But as a whole, we actually provide a very comprehensive view if you actually want to enter Indonesia itself. So what we actually mainly do are just three things. One is that we actually help to facilitate business needs. So if you actually need any market entry assistance, such as incorporation, tax advisory, recruitment, sourcing for office locations, we actually have a series of partners that we can connect you with. And from time to time, we actually do also have requests from our Indonesian corporates. So if you actually get in touch with us, we will also connect you to some of the opportunities that these Indonesian corporates have actually surfaced to us. And other things that we've organized, such as missions trips. For instance, this virtual one that we have is to enable knowledge transfer. And we also do one-to-one business matching for companies. So like what I mentioned, today I'll actually be covering the snapshot of the entire Indonesia's economy. And it's actually ready to provide a general macroeconomic view of what Indonesia is about and what are the growing opportunities. What you see on this slide is actually just a very quick summary. I'll be covering it in the next few slides and I'll actually explain it in greater detail. So Indonesia itself is actually the 16th largest economy in the world. It is actually a very big economy. It's also the largest economy in Southeast Asia. In fact, when we actually speak to Singapore companies, they actually tell us that the opportunity is actually very huge because there's more than 270 million people in Indonesia itself. And there's actually many multiples of Singapore's population. And so they find that this is actually a very big location, a big market for them to actually enter in. But naturally, of course, with a big market, there's also different complexities in the market itself. And I'm sure that you're actually aware, we actually need to also be able to navigate the market well also. So Indonesia's GDP is actually more than US$1 trillion in 2020, and it has actually been growing at a steady rate of about 5% from 2016 to 2019. And if you actually take a look at the leftmost graph, you actually will notice that the dip actually happened last year. It was an exception where the GDP growth was actually at a negative 2.07%. And the key reason is actually the pandemic. In fact, this is also the first recession since the Asian financial crisis 20 plus years ago. So you can actually see that even Indonesia was also not spared from the crisis, but it's actually still doing better than the world average itself. In Indonesia, the FDI inflows actually range between 20 to 30 $20 to $30 billion US, and there's actually a couple of main invested sectors such as transportation, warehouse, telecoms, electricity, gas, water, housing, industrial estates, office buildings, metals, machinery, electronics, and construction. And the popular destinations in Indonesia are Denpasar, which is a city in Bali, Jakarta, and Batam. So the urban population and labor force and consumption will still continue to see very strong and continuous growth. And what you actually will notice is that about 56% of the population actually resides in urban areas, but it's actually projected to actually increase in 2045 to about 67%. So more and more people are actually moving to the urban areas as well. There's also a greater growth in consuming class, as well as the labor force growth in the entire sector. One of the things that I mentioned just now was that Indonesia actually experienced its first recession since the Asian financial crisis. But the entire pandemic itself also brought about unequal opportunities to different sectors. You'll notice in this graph, there's actually a couple of sectors such as mining, manufacturing, construction, logistics, that have actually all experienced negative growth last year. But there are some sectors such as social services, ICT, and agriculture that actually has experienced a positive growth. And perhaps maybe just to be a little bit more relevant to today's sharing, for the ICT sector in particular, we actually noticed that it's also because of the growth in the digital economy. The pandemic has actually fueled people to actually move online. And then as a result, there's actually a greater need for such digital services as well. So Indonesia itself benefits from its demographic dividend. In fact, it has a really young population and has a median age of about 30 years old. And most of them are actually digital natives. They're very well acquainted digitally. So if they want to make payments, they use e-wallets. If they want to shop online, they go on board Tokopedia, Shopee on e-commerce platforms. If they want to do ride-hailing, they actually use GoPay as well as, they also use Gojek as well as Grab to actually do their ride-hailing as well. So they're actually well acquainted throughout the entire lifestyle when it comes to using these digital technologies. And there's also a greater demand for a mobile-first approach with a very high smartphone penetration rate. And what we actually notice is that they actually spend a very long amount of time. On average, they actually spend about 8.5 hours a day on these smartphones. So majority of the activities actually still happen in Java, and actually with Jakarta actually being the economic center for Indonesia itself. And amongst the various cities, Jakarta, Bandung, and Surabaya actually experience the highest levels of digital activities with, and based on a report by Deloitte, they mentioned that they actually spend more than 5 hours a week on online platforms. And outside of Jakarta, there's also other opportunities businesses can actually explore as well, such as those cities which are the largest by population. We have Surabaya as well as Medan that also presents such opportunities also. Finally, Indonesia has actually been climbing up the ranks in terms of the ease of doing business with pro-business policies such as the omnibus law on job creation as well as the online submission system. So we actually have noticed that I think since 2013, the ease of doing business has actually improved based on the World Bank rankings. It has actually improved from a ranking of 120 to number 73 in 2020 itself. And this is because of the pro-business policies. The omnibus law on job creation last year was one of the very significant moves that's actually aimed to simplify licensing regimes, improve labor flexibility, and provide more supportive government policies. And this actually helps to really encourage businesses to set up. For instance, they actually help to ease administrative hurdles, especially in manpower policies, especially in terms of hiring foreigners, or maybe even the severance pay or benefits, and also giving them greater flexibility to hire outsourced workers. These are actually some ways in which they actually help the businesses to grow as well. They also adopted a risk-based licensing approach where they wanted to simplify the licensing, especially for lower risk activities. And the negative investment list has also been revised so that more foreign businesses can actually invest in the sector. And just recently in August, the online submission system was also being launched. And I think as some companies would actually know, to actually enter Indonesia and to navigate the regulatory process is actually not very easy. And with the advent of the online submission system, this actually would make it easier without having to go through a lot of different ministries and agencies. And all of them is actually now envisioned to centralize the processes and to make permits and licensing applications much easier. So perhaps this is also just my last slide as well. And I think this are actually some things that we actually have observed amongst companies when they're actually setting up their presence in Indonesia. As you may know, Indonesia is actually a very big market. There's actually a lot of opportunities. But then again, it also presents its challenges as well. So Indonesia, under the first one, under market setup considerations, Indonesia actually has a very booming startup culture. There's actually a growing base of startups, And it's also the home to 7 unicorns in the market as well. And as a result, it has also attracted quite a fair bit of funding and venture capital interest in the market. And that is why it's also one of the fastest growing markets in Southeast Asia as well. In addition, when companies actually want to enter, they also would need to consider the type of market entry. So for instance, they need to consider whether they want to do a wholly owned, a JV, or working through resellers or system integrators as well. And all these different types of market entry modes actually have its pros and cons. Some of them actually have paid up capital requirements. Some of them also depend on an expansion strategy, as well as the relationships with the various distributors, resellers, or system integrators. So for all these, I think for companies, it's actually very good to understand and maybe balance it out to decide which is actually a very good market entry mode for you. The second one, of course, is actually more nuanced and something that we also need to actually keep in mind because we need to always understand the Indonesian culture. In fact, actually, when we interact with Indonesian companies, I think one of the feedback that we often get is that Singapore companies tend to be quite transactional in the way we actually approach things. And most of the time when we go in, we want to sell the solution that we actually have. But for Indonesian companies, they value relationships, and building such relationships actually take time. So during the first meeting or second meeting, they would just want to know more about a company. They don't like to be sold something immediately. And they want to really look at building a business partnership for the long term as well. So as a result, because of this, we need to actually be more culturally sensitive when we actually are navigating the Indonesian culture as well. They also have a preference for personal touch. So things such as politeness, patience are actually very key aspects of this business culture. In fact, actually right now, because most of the meetings are actually done virtually, this is also much harder to do as well, because it's very much harder to build a personal relationship with the Indonesian counterparts. And so what you can do is to also tap on your various business partners as much as possible, especially if they're actually in market, that will be actually an added bonus. And this will actually help to develop the trust and relationships over time. And a lot of Indonesian companies usually ask our Singapore companies what is their track record. And they wanted to know what are some of the similar projects that they have actually done before. So if you can actually prepare things such as case studies or maybe your past examples of successful projects, this will actually be very beneficial in trying to steer the conversations with our Indonesian companies. The last point on adapting to the market is really trying to invest time and to understand and refine the problem statements. Sometimes when there's actually a meeting, the problem statements might not be very clear. So then this is actually where we will need to actually spend time to maybe ask and question and also to understand what they actually really want. So with this, it will make our solutions more customized, more adaptable to what our Indonesian companies would want in general. So with this, I think I've actually reached the end of my presentation. I've actually left our contacts over here. So feel free to actually get in touch with us. We'll be actually happy to know more Singapore companies as well, because we actually have regular interactions with our Indonesian counterparts, and they would like to know what are the upcoming companies that we actually have, and we'll be happy to actually connect you with them as well. So with this, thanks very much, and thanks very much for taking the time to actually hear my presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Blias. Thanks for the very insightful sharing. So audience, if you have any questions, please post them in the Q&A box and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation and at the end of the last presentation. So next up, we will have Mr. Terence O. So Mr. Terence O is the Director of Dealing Asia Western Union Business Solutions. Terence has more than 20 years of experience in the financial sector and held a variety of senior roles, including a stint in New York as the Global Head of FX Prime Brokerage and Clearing for UBS Investment Bank. His role at Western Union Business Solutions is focused on setting and executing the go-to-market strategy with core customers by creating a richer value proposition to support their international business growth and aspirations. He leads the regional CRM, key account, and digital RM teams, which serve customers wishing to execute trades and make payments, and which strive to establish commercial long-term relationships with customers. So let's welcome Terence, please.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for your time. I hope I'll make your investment worthwhile. And thank you, Ying. You did a much more comprehensive introduction of me than I could have hoped for. So let me share my slides first and talk a little bit about myself. So most of the audience probably knows the brand Western Union, but have you heard of Western Union Business Solutions? Western Union Business Solutions is the premier partner for businesses hoping to send, receive, and manage international payments and to optimize their cross-border risk. Our network spans 200 countries and territories. We have the ability to pay in over 130 currencies, and we provide robust hedging solutions, robust KYC, anti-money laundering, and fraud monitoring infrastructure to give businesses peace of mind. So that's our part of the business and not the consumer transfer part of the business. With that, Blias has done a lot to frame the discussion I was intending to hold. So thank you very much, because that's perfect as an introduction to what I'm going to say. Now, usually what we start these conferences with is an overview of why businesses internationally are excited about Southeast Asia in general before zooming into the country. So one of the things we like to talk about is a projected shift in global economic power. As mature economies slow in growth, where are the next growth opportunities that investors look at? And PwC did a study projecting possible growth in multiple emerging countries. You'll be excited to hear that Indonesia, for example, is projected to overtake the German economy by 2050. Now, these shifts are due to a couple of things. One, basically, like I said, mature economies have plateaued in terms of potential innovative growth, and investors are always looking at where the next growth opportunities are. Secondly, as we look back on what has been behind the success and growth of the European bloc, for example, a big story behind that, as I go to my next slide, is what we call the regionalization trend. Even before the global pandemic hit, we would have said that there was already a trend to regionalization. There was increased protectionism and nationalism among big economies. But what the pandemic has brought to mind is the fact that, one, global supply chains, which used to be running on very cheap shipping and logistic costs, are threatened and have been threatened by the unexpected events of the pandemic. So businesses which have designed themselves around global just-in-time manufacturing, expecting every part of the supply chain to be flowing smoothly, have suddenly realized that they need to diversify their sources. They need to be able to diversify their manufacturing risk and their export locations. That could mean that as much as 16 to 26% of global exports, and global exports would be worth about 4.6 trillion in 2018, could be relocated by 2025 due to factors such as domestic production or shift to new overseas locations. One of the big stories pre-pandemic was the China plus one story, where as China was getting more and more expensive for international corporations, already regions like or countries like Vietnam and Indonesia start to become attractive due to the large domestic populations, the proximity to other sources of manufacturing, and the ability to plug in on that growing economic story. Now, that story of growing supply chain costs is not just a trivial one. If you look at my next chart, this is the real story, right? The container shipping costs have gone up almost 20 times that of pre-pandemic costs. That is a huge hit to all businesses. I've talked to factory owners in China, for example, and this is a really interesting story that used to supply dollar store in the US, our equivalent of the value dollar store where things are put down to a very, very low price. With the advent of these shipping costs, the dollar store model is no longer viable. In the US, they're now talking about $3, $5 stores. In terms of the manufacturers that used to provide goods to these dollar stores, it's no longer economically feasible to provide goods at the same cost that can be sold for $1. So there will be a fundamental shift in spending habits, in manufacturing, in distribution. So how does that then relate to Indonesia? Southeast Asia and Indonesia, again, if you've seen my regionalization slides, will definitely benefit from creating its own economic bloc and being more dependent on your closer neighbors than for far supply chains. So most of us based in Singapore, for all we know, in 5 years' time, instead of doing Taobao from China, we might find it cheaper to use equivalent platforms from Vietnam and Indonesia to fill our homes. Simple as that. Which leads us then to the story of Indonesia. So I'm supposed to lay the landscape here for fintech and ICT, and the following speaker will speak about opportunities. But the two are completely intertwined, so hopefully I'll lay the ground for the next speaker to expand on this. Digital technology adoption has definitely been accelerated by the pandemic. And it's interesting for me doing research into this topic, that if you look at older articles about Indonesia and what are the opportunities and the landscape there, the story mostly was about how underserved the market was. Now, that story is still true, but what has happened, as Blias has mentioned earlier, that the pandemic has accelerated digital adoption. We are closer to that widespread adoption being a reality, although there are certainly real challenges. Fast facts that I pulled from a different source, credit due. Just in 2020, now 8% of all sales in Indonesia come from e-commerce sources. 61% come from mobile commerce. So for us tech people, we realize that there's a big gap between PC adoption and mobile and e-shopping adoption that influences this trend significantly. 29% of e-commerce spend was done using digital and mobile wallets. Indonesia pretty much has one of the richest ecosystems and one of the largest number of mobile wallet e-payment channel players that we know of. 17% of 2020 POS spend. So point of sale systems, somebody walking up to shop a warung-warung, 17% of those are done using digital wallets, which is something that is a very, very significant figure if you, again, think about the size of the population of Indonesia alone. So I'm not going to just spend all the time reading these statistics. They are readily available, but it's an example of how far and how fast Indonesia has come, but also a great motivator for us in terms of understanding what potential there is if we are in there as early as possible. When we are talking about large numbers of consumers interacting with financial channels, I have to bring in, again, fraud prevention, right? It's one thing to enable businesses and channels to serve consumers in a large country, another to ensure that your businesses are protected from fraud, your end customers are protected from fraud by partnering with a payment channel that has a very, very active monitoring and fraud prevention infrastructure. Sorry, little plug there for my business. Moving on, the fintech landscape in Indonesia is very rich, as I have mentioned. I think Blias has mentioned the investment from different players. Let me just throw a few facts at you with regards to payments and fintech. In Indonesia, there are over 300 fintech startups already registered with the OJK, who is the Indonesia Financial Services Authority. Some brief overview of what these kinds of businesses are. We have 148 entities registered for P2P lending. We have 4 platforms for equity crowdfunding. And then, big fat tail of payments companies, credit scoring companies, financial planners, insurance brokers, wealth managers, robo-advisors. You can see that the theme for fintechs in Indonesia is one of trying to ride on the wave of increasing urbanization and wealth that Blias has mentioned earlier, attempting to catch it as it comes in. But Indonesia is also a story of 2 countries and 2 people. We have the large segment of urban rich, the 60 and 80 to 80 million people who live in urban centers are, served like you and I with Grab food and Grab rides. But there's also the huge proportion, the 60% of population living out in remote islands of the archipelago. And it will be amiss of us not to mention that there are 2 overriding themes here. One is of accessibility. So the exciting opportunities for ourselves in the ICT and fintech industries is around that fact of accessibility, whether we are talking about infrastructure and reach, or whether we are talking simply about additional financial solutions for the unbanked and the underbanked. I'm just going to move on from here. I just want to raise one more point here. Blias talked about the positive business environment. The OJK has also taken tremendous steps. Like the MAS, they have recognized the potential of the fintech industry. They have recognized how important and structurally critical to the safe running of Indonesia that the financial sector can be. They've created a very, very comprehensive framework, what they call a responsible finance framework, to oversee and regulate fintechs among stakeholders like the regulator themselves, the financial industry, and the customer. So, things like customer protection, customer empowerment, and most importantly, again, for us in the audience, financial access and literacy, training a workforce of IT savvy workers who will be able to support this rise in IT services. That is a huge focus of the OJK and something worth all of us paying attention to. I'm going to skip ahead. I talked about huge growth in ICT. The Indonesian economy is expected to grow a very strong 58% between 2019 and 2029. The financial services, for example, is expected to grow 79% against the growth of the economy itself, which is a healthy 58%. IT's programming services are expected to grow 108%. And even high-tech goods are expected to grow 62%, higher than the growth rate of the Indonesia economy. So when you look at the trends that are coming to boost digital connectivity and provide universal access to the internet, to provide and ensure a digital economy that works for all, not just the urban, but the underserved, and using digital technologies to provide better public services and improve the quality of the citizens' life, you can see that there are opportunities for all of us sitting in this room right now. One thing that we like to talk about is services exports. So services account for 55% of all global trade flows, which is 13.7 trillion of cross-border transactions in 2019. And the share of services in that 13.7 trillion rose from 19% in 1995 to 24% in 2019. Sorry about just throwing figures out there. But this is what gets us excited because, you know, when we usually look at the economic growth of the country and the manufacturing and the domestic output, services has become an increasingly important part of that picture. And for us in the ICT industry, again, facilitating the flow of services becomes a massive opportunity. What services then? B2B businesses, any B2B businesses from an Indonesian context, the digitalization of MSMEs. Let me pull out a figure if you will bear with me. Okay, not in front of me right now, but a huge part of the Indonesian economy has to do with small and medium businesses and the millions of warungs distributed, 3.5 million traditional warungs distributed across Indonesia. That is a huge number of businesses that you can reach in order to facilitate their access to financial services and increase their connectivity and ways of doing business. Small businesses account for 60% of Indonesia's economy and account for 95% of its domestic working population. So as you can see, any improvement in the way we facilitate the growth of services and the way businesses operate would be a massive impact to the way of life in Indonesia. And certainly, businesses these days like to talk about ESG, right? Being able to conduct a successful business, exporting services and improving the lives of people is a really nice story for any business to be able to tell. I want to pause here, go off the books slightly. I think all the positives are great, but what can be challenges about operating in Indonesia in the tech sector? With 7 unicorns in the picture and more in the pipeline. In fact, one of them is a decacorn, isn't it? Where is the growth coming from next? E-commerce is the obvious one. Fintechs and the whole fintech ecosystem I mentioned around, accessibility, the ability to replace cash with digital payments, the ecosystem around that involving P2P lending, payments, financial planning, insurance product, etc. That is a huge area of focus and certainly why the OJK pays so much attention to it. But what are the things that could put a roadblock in front of us expanding into that? The first and most obvious, and I have alluded to that, is infrastructure and connectivity. Indonesia is an archipelago made up of many remotely separated islands with many small towns, some of which have small populations. So it's both an opportunity and a risk because the connectivity to reach these customers is a major investment in telco and other connectivity technologies enabling these businesses to reach the internet. Financial services will be a challenge because as simple a thing as verifying the identity of a person opening an account, whether it be with a digital wallet or a bank, is a challenge in remote areas, but also a challenge and an opportunity to the players in eKYC, for example. Establishing businesses in Indonesia, Blias has mentioned the improvements there, but it still ranks 76 out of 150 countries, not the easiest country to navigate. And finally, I think this is something that shouldn't be overlooked, simply recruiting talent. I have myself experience in operating a tech-related business in Indonesia. And while IT salaries and payrolls are not at the levels of some of the other hotter countries, certainly the huge population of Indonesia bears with it the potential for a massive workforce. But as the OJK pointed out, the challenge is that level of literacy and training required to bump up that workforce. So in the immediate future, in the short to medium term, companies setting up in Indonesia will be challenged to find talent, challenged to find the level of IT competency that you may think you need to set up your business successfully. But hopefully in the long term, that will turn around. Other than the financial ecosystem, what else could we think about? Well, mobility, everybody's working from home. In a widely dispersed country, that's a bigger problem and a more fun problem to solve. Software as a service, being able to provide distributed services across the entire infrastructure in Indonesia. I keep talking about fraud prevention, and side by side with that, fraud prevention from a payment provider's point of view like ours is simply about ensuring that we detect patterns of payments that are unusual, that we are not paying to persons that should not be receiving this money. But around that, there's another tech layer of cyber identity, cyber security that cannot be overlooked, that will be massive, massive in growth. AI and analytics, when you deal with one of the largest populations in the world, certainly a lot is needed to understand whether your business strategies are successful. And finally, Internet of Things, let's not forget that, hot topic right now, but certainly, again, relevant in a widely dispersed country. I've talked a lot, I'm gonna pause there. And very quickly, please bear with me. I know many people are not familiar with Western Union Business Solutions, or even why I'm talking at a tech conference. So I'll run through this really, really quickly to help you understand why we are here. Western Union Business Solutions works on essentially the concept of partnerships. We are B2B solutions providers. We help facilitate your B2B2C. Our reach right now through Whoops, our shortcut for the whole long name, with the combination of Whoops and Western Union, we reach 100 million customers, 1,000 plus NGOs, 500 plus financial institutions, 700 plus universities around the world. So plugging into our network, which we see as one of the strengths and one of the largest and most robust in the world, allows you to utilize that extremely strong network to complement whatever services you are providing. Different partnership models have been developed for the different kinds of partners that we work with, but essentially the idea is simply an enhanced offering, creating shared business growth and creating additional revenue for everyone in the picture. We have worked with fintech partners who augment their existing payment offerings to fill a gap in their regional coverage or payment methods. We have worked with payment disbursements in payrolls, expenses. We've worked with large partners, which I will not name here, to ensure that those go to multinational companies and tens, thousands of employees all over the world in these multinational companies, shipping companies and their crew, etc. And global payments, essentially for software companies looking to add payments as a new feature to their platforms. Again, payroll, travel and expense, and other types of B2C global payments. I will skip this because that's a perfect conversation to have. Why partner with Western Union Business Solutions? But again, the reach that we have, we are already connected to many small businesses, corporates, financial institutions, legal organizations, educational institutions, and indeed NGOs through many, many payment solutions, both incoming and outgoing. And from a technology perspective, we offer many ways of branding our partnership and many ways of integrating to our systems to deliver an efficient solution. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope it was useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Terence, for sharing your insights. So again, to the audience, please post your questions in the Q&A box. And the last presenter for today is Mr. Omer Wilson, VP Marketing APAC of Digital Realty, who will be sharing on the opportunities in Indonesia's IT sector. So Omar is the Vice President of Marketing for Digital Realty. Prior to joining Digital Realty, Omar has held several MNC roles in Jones Lang LaSalle and IBM, and a number of marketing leadership and product development roles within the IT, consulting, real estate, and media industries. So he's also a regular keynote speaker at industry events. So he's very familiar with topics such as technology, data infrastructure, marketing trends, and also futurist themes. Without further ado, let's welcome Omar, please.
Thanks a lot, Ying. Appreciate the introduction and excellent content so far. So hopefully I'll be able to build on a lot of the groundwork already laid by the other speakers and add a little bit more from a ICT, IT, and really from our expertise area, data center perspective. Let me just check that my slides are seen okay. I assume they're...
Yeah, you can turn on the slideshow mode.
Excellent.
Okay, great.
Thanks, Ying. So from our perspective, again, I'm not going to linger too much because, as I mentioned, Blias and Terence did such a good job on the macro trends, but I think it's worth looking at a few specifically with how they impact the IT sector and how that sort of comes down to the data center world, which we're within as Digital Realty, and what that means for Indonesia moving forward. So obviously we heard around the GDP, you know, a slight drop from last year, no surprises, due to the pandemic from 20 onwards, but obviously a very large growth trajectory for the next 10 to 15 years, huge smartphone penetration, and a very large internet user base. Now the two numbers at the end is very key for us, again, from an IT sector perspective. 99% of internet users watch online videos. Now this is a huge impact on data traffic, as you can imagine, and the point was made earlier around the geographic nature of Indonesia as well, which means that the network cable system and telecom system is going to be one of the sectors which we see seeing huge investment growth from really now into the next decade. And tied to that, obviously, our sector in terms of data centers as the hub of a lot of the digital commerce and developments that we foresee in Indonesia. 5G as well, to be launched across 9 Indonesian cities by the end of this year. IoT was mentioned earlier. 5G is going to be the driving force a lot of the applications. And as you can see from that 9-city statement, that Indonesia is really focusing heavily on the next stage of growth for 5G and the applications that will impact. On the right, again, the digital economy, huge growth, 8-fold by 2030, and direct impact on the economic productivity of the country as well. Now, a little bit later on in the presentation, when focusing on IT and the ICT sectors, we're going to talk about a concept which we've been driving for the last year and a half, and has been, a key part of our reporting, which is around a concept called data gravity. And I'll touch on the importance of data gravity for Jakarta. But it's such a key connectivity center that from a data center and ICT sector growth, we see Jakarta especially becoming a key hub. And we've already seen key investments from many of the global hyperscale cloud providers, such as Google, Alibaba, and Tencent. And these are big statements. I mean, these cloud providers have always invested heavily in Singapore and continue to do so. But this is a big statement from them continuing over the last few years and into the future, where they're now expanding both, a number of made high visibility acquisitions in the Indonesian market as well, but they're also now investing their infrastructure, which we feel is a very key statement for the future of Jakarta and the IT sectors. So this is from Structured Research, who's very good on co-location and data center sizing. And if you follow data center investment, generally you're following technology and IT. That's the easiest way to think of it. You know, you look at the major hubs for Asia, they're massive fintech, IT and e-commerce hubs. So Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo, Shanghai, Sydney, you know, these are all big centers. What you're going to see now, as these charts are showing up to 2025, is that the market size itself for Jakarta, it's specifically, has got a 5-year CAGR of over 23%. And likewise, in terms of the megawatt size as well, corresponding with that, it is projected to go up to about 205 megawatts by 2025. And post that, we don't see this chart slowing down. We actually see it exponentially getting faster. So the message really is that Jakarta as a center for Indonesia is very underserved as of today for data center. And as I said earlier, we'd argue telecom and network infrastructure as well, which really go hand in hand. So the opportunities for further investment and growth is substantial. And all of this foundation will drive the opportunities around the ICT sectors, as we saw earlier with the examples of Google, Tencent and Alibaba investing in Jakarta. So I'd like to now move on to briefly take you through why we see this as important for Indonesia and Jakarta specifically. And we launched, as I mentioned a year and a half ago, a global report, which will be released biannually moving forward. You can find the latest one on our website. But it's basically looking at the global metros and cities from a data gravity intensity perspective. So what we found, and the founder of the concept of data gravity is on our leadership team, is that actually data, similar to the gravitational pull of planets and stars, has a pull on economic value, on IT sector growth, and there's actually a mechanism for calculating that intensity. And that this is the formula we use, which is based on data mass, data activity, and bandwidth, all divided by latency. So again, coming back to that point around networks. And when we look at Jakarta, a lot of why this is happening becomes quite clear, and as mentioned by a few of the earlier speakers. Firstly, the enterprise sector is becoming the world's host of data. So by 2025, 80% of the data worldwide will reside in enterprises. What we've seen from both the fintech and ICT sectors in Indonesia is there's a huge amount of data being generated. We saw earlier from the slides I shared around the video access, 99%. There's a massive young population and a very mobile first population. This is increasing the volume of data that needs to be aggregated, stored, and as we're seeing from the unicorns and decacorns coming out of Indonesia, it's also increasing the opportunities around the IT sector for new organizations and solutions to appear. It's not by chance that the apps are coming out of Indonesia and spreading not just across Asia, but you'd argue across the world eventually, and more so. And we believe that trend's going to continue. M&As, globalization, driving corporates, to M&A more to achieve scale. Again, I mentioned earlier, we've got a few big examples, Alibaba being one of them, but more and more acquisition type growth we see as well within the Indonesian market will happen. We'll see Indonesian companies themselves come out, but we'll see a lot of the large US, Chinese, and other located global players come in and acquire more of these large growth players from Indonesia. This again will drive the IT sector within Indonesia itself as well, where the digital user base is really based. And that takes to the third column there, what's happening in the current trend globally. And as Terence rightly pointed out, driven very much and sped up by the pandemic, is that digitally enabled interactions are really increasing digitization of the workflows. So there's a 2 times greater importance versus physical interactions around digitally enterprise interactions. And this is increasing, again, enterprise data exchange volumes globally. So that's why, if you recall the metric we used earlier, latency and network becomes so key. So again, going to the nature of the geographic spread of Indonesia, you know, the access of the increasingly middle class population that's not just based in Jakarta is going to need the network system. And again, this is why the IT sector and the infrastructure sector has got such big opportunity in Indonesia. Data localization, again, Indonesia went through a few different financial services laws, banking laws around data hosting that were held and then reappeared and held again. But this is a trend not unique to Indonesia. As mentioned earlier, this is happening globally. This is going to require data locally, whatever happens. This is where the world is going. Hopefully, you know, in terms of global data flows, this doesn't impact the nature of global commerce, but this is a trend that nobody can deny is happening, and in Indonesia will be the same. The uniqueness of somewhere like Indonesia is the amount of data that will need to be stored locally. And again, a stat there that we use by 2022, 87% of IT leaders will maintain local copies of customer and transaction data for compliance. So you can imagine, again, with the large population, increasingly a middle class and more wealthier population over time, and a mobile-based population, the amount of data storage required and the IT infrastructure in Indonesia itself is going to be huge. And then the integration of physical and digital security systems. Again, previous speakers talked about security more and more. This is increasing. Again, the pandemic has accelerated the news around various fraud attacks and cyber attacks and systems going down. But by 2023, 70% of security products will integrate IT, OT, IoT systems. So basically what that means is securing the systems becomes even more of an issue when you're in the world of Internet of Things and 5G, simply because there's so many more systems that can be hacked and endpoints, you know, within the house, within the home, within our everyday lives. And again, this increases the types and volume of data creation and exchange. So if we look from a global to regional to Indonesia from an opportunity perspective, the global trend around data gravity intensity is without a doubt on an exponential curve. So globally, the metric we've reached by 2024 is 139% CAGR, so huge compound annual growth rate. Really looking at the 53 largest global metros in the world. And then when we come down to a regional perspective, Asia, won't surprise many of you, has the largest compound annual growth rate of, again, data gravity, 153%. Faster rates in North America and EMEA as well. EMEA has the highest centers as of today, based on the intensity of data. But Asia is where the largest growth is coming from a IT and data transfer perspective. And where does Indonesia, and specifically again, because we're looking at metros here, Jakarta sit? Well, you'll see there huge growth rate. In fact, the highest, 211% by 2024, based on our measure of data intensity growth. So the largest of all the regions. In terms of the growth, you might be wondering, why is the charts higher on the others? That's because their daily gigabytes per second data traffic as of today is higher, but their growth rates is nowhere near to where Jakarta is going. So there's, as we looked in the growth metrics from 2024 to 2030, as Indonesia becomes, one of the largest economies in the world, this isn't going to slow down. And again, the opportunities for the IT sector across the board are huge, including the infrastructure sector. And top 6 metros in the world, and Jakarta is one of them. And you'll be, for those that have noticed there, 4 of them themselves are within the Asia Pacific region. But Jakarta, huge connectivity center, major banking and financial hub, and represents a significant portion of trade and services for Indonesia. So no getting away from that. Of course, there's the discussions ongoing around the move from Jakarta, but as of today, given the population size and the requirement to serve the rest of Indonesia, Jakarta is where we see the bulk of the infrastructure and IT investment value sitting, which is substantial. based on our analysis. So just to end and touching again on the tying it to Indonesia from our perspective. So we are the largest operator of data centers by physical number and size, 290 across the globe. A lot of customers, as you can imagine, both hyperscale cloud, enterprise, financial services, telco, network. So we see a lot of these shifts around data investment and IT opportunity, which is why, again, when we look at where we're investing and where we're growing, the usual, as I mentioned earlier, the IT hubs of Asia are prominent. So Osaka, huge data center cluster for Japan. Tokyo, one of the largest in the region. Seoul, where we're just about to open our first facility, but another big hub. Singapore, without a doubt, probably the hub still in the region, arguably in terms of data transfer and traffic. Hong Kong, we're about to open our second facility, and then Melbourne and Sydney from a Australasia and ANZ perspective, the largest hubs. But at the bottom right there, you'll see nothing that we can announce of today, but it'll give you a feel from where we're looking actively and hope to announce something soon as we can, is Jakarta. Just again, going back to the earlier point, because of the underserved nature of that location and the sheer demand we're seeing from multiple hyperscale cloud, e-commerce, financial services and technology companies to come into the Indonesian market and Jakarta specifically. So to give us a good time for Q&A, I'm going to hand back to Ying, and I'll be ready to answer any questions that have come through, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Omar. So now let's welcome all our panelists back on stage. And yes, we do have some questions coming in through the Q&A box, so let's address them. Yeah, we have a question on ease of doing business in Indonesia. So Puneet mentioned that being a Singapore registered business, developing and selling software with no office in Indonesia, there tends to be some issues. So issues with withholding tax and also other taxes. So maybe Blias, would you be able to advise us on any taxes and duties issues on Singapore companies in Indonesia?
Yeah, thanks very much. And also thanks very much to Puneet for this question as well. In fact, actually, I also understand that tomorrow there's also a session on the tax regime in particular. So I think they'll probably delve deeper into this. But actually, in general, in terms of all these taxes, it also really depends on where you actually intend to locate. So there are actually some special economic zones within Indonesia itself that probably has various tax incentives. So that could actually be one. But I think in general, there's also those general taxes that actually do apply. For instance, like your corporate tax will also actually come in as well. So I think I'll just probably leave it to the speaker tomorrow. I think they will actually break it down into greater detail. And you probably can also get your more in-depth queries on that as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Blias, for doing the advert. Yes, indeed, we do have another session tomorrow, touching specifically on the legal and tax regime, as well as touching on the smart city development in Jakarta. So do sign up for it if you are interested. And okay, let's go on to the next question from Yuju. So the rules in Indonesia do not apply uniformly between foreign companies and local companies. So when it comes to import and customs clearance, local companies have to be very creative to import at the cheapest and lowest cost. Yeah. So any comments on that? How can foreign companies try to do this, and whether foreign companies are indeed constantly targeted on this? Anyone?
Maybe I'll just answer this question. I think it's actually more related to Enterprise Singapore as well. So actually, in terms of import and custom duties, yes, you're right. I think they actually tend to be high when companies actually want to do an export. In fact, actually, for import and export, there's usually this thing called de minimis value. So actually anything that is actually above $3 actually will actually be subjected to taxes as well. And this is actually for general trade, import and export that I'm referring to. So usually when a company actually wants to enter Indonesia, they will actually experience that much higher markup as a result. And when we actually have spoken to some companies, what they have actually suggested were two things. One is that whether they could actually source for some of these products locally, then this will actually help to reduce like any cross-border related taxes, imports and duties. So that's actually one. And second one, of course, is that if they are actually able to actually just do the shipment from Singapore, as long as the cost margins itself are actually enough to actually bear this higher cost, they would be able to do this shipment. What they usually tell us was that at least they want to try out and test out the product in the market to see whether that there is a demand for that. So actually at the start, it might actually be of a much higher cost, but at least they know whether people actually want to demand more of their items. Then after, if there's actually a demand, then they will find other ways in which they can actually bring the product into the market at a much lower cost. So we do actually have some partners that's actually able to help you to configure it accordingly, and we'll actually be happy to link you up as well. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we can touch on a more broader question. So generic advice for ICT companies to start business in Jakarta. Are there any landmines that you can identify? Maybe Terence?
Okay, let me take a load of Blias. Not to do with registration, but simply because operating in a new country brings about with it certain risks from my area of specialty, which is foreign exchange, right? I mean, Western Union Business Solutions, we are foreign exchange specialists front and foremost. And foreign exchange risks are not maybe managed as well or thought of as a first priority when expanding to a new country. It brings risk in two ways. It brings risk to your receivables, because you'll be writing contracts with customers and partners where you expect incoming payments that could vary if you're not hedging or managing that risk, right? It could bring risk to your costs because you have suppliers to pay. It could bring with it even a tail solution. I mean, I hate to bring this up, but my dad was a major importer and exporter out of Indonesia just prior to the Asian financial crisis. But when it happened, 80% of his accounts receivables were lost simply from the massive movements. So it's something that we all don't really think about as core to business, but certainly something that we need to put in there. The other aspect to it, of course, is from a Forex perspective. Imagine if you are two companies competing for business with an Indonesian entity. You are willing to receive payments in Indonesian rupiah because you're able to manage that payment and stabilize the price for your product. Your competitors asking for a dollar price because that's the usual mode of operation. So there's a competitive edge in there that's rarely thought about, but it's something that you should be thinking about if you're expanding in there. So that's my part of it. Blias, back to you.
Yeah, I think Terence actually covered it very well as well. So, I mean, I think just echoing the same sentiments as Terence, I think if you actually have any assistance you actually require, you can actually do approach Enterprise Singapore also.
Okay, Omar, any views on advice for ICT companies targeting Indonesia?
Yeah, not much to add. I think from our perspective, and maybe it's a little bit specific to our industry in terms of data centers, but I don't think so. I think finding a good partner is always a nice place to start. There's different ways of approaching that, but when you operate in the infrastructure world, but also depending on which part of the IT industry you're in, having a good on-the-ground partner who knows the landscape of Indonesia and Jakarta and wherever you're looking to invest or grow is always beneficial. So I think choosing that right partner is something that can increase your ability to have a smooth entry, let's say, but also your chance to grow with your product set. So that's the main piece I have. But I'd also reiterate, what both Terence and Blind said around looking at the different apparatus that is open to you, both from an Indonesian government perspective and also Singapore government perspective. You know, that when you're thinking of partners, those are always good partners to start with. And then also then you can go into the private sector and then find, you know, other good partners that can help within your specific sector. Is probably my thoughts there.
All right, thank you. So I do see some interesting questions coming up regarding corruption in Indonesia. So this can be quite sensitive. Would anyone want to comment on this? Looks like Blias. Do you have any insights to share? Maybe generic ways that companies can take, you know, to overcome this.
Yeah, so actually our typical advice for companies is that when actually entering markets like Indonesia, it's actually important to keep your eyes wide open. Because I think in this market, there's actually a couple of nuances that you actually will need to take care of. And what we usually recommend companies to do is probably also work with in-market partners as well. So they actually will help you to navigate these. So for instance, if you actually work with a consultant, for example, they will actually help you to navigate all these like different challenges that you actually face on the ground as well. So I mean, this is actually what we usually recommend to our companies too. Yeah, hope this answers the question. Yeah.
Yeah. There's also another question regarding PDPA and data security concerns. Would this also be relevant for Omar to answer?
Yeah, no, specifically, I guess we spoke earlier around the, a little bit, I mentioned the financial services regulations around data hosting. Yeah, I think data security, honestly, is going to, as I mentioned in my presentation, is an issue, is a global issue. So it's certainly not specific to Indonesia or Jakarta, I would argue. This is something around cyber threats, and as with the catalyst from the pandemic, as more and more of our lives go online, so do banking and e-commerce transactions. And unfortunately, that's very appealing to people that would like to access that. So I think I would argue, maybe others disagree, I don't think there's anything specifically different around data security. I think you need to take the same approach wherever you are in the world, would be my thoughts there.
Okay.
I'm sorry to sound like a broken record. Data security applies to private companies, obviously operating in their duty of consumer protection. When it comes to international payments, though, there is a duty of all regulators and the associated payment channels to provide proper KYC and AML information, which can be sensitive data, and that's a consideration.
Okay, so maybe a question from me. So are there any innovations or any breakthroughs that anyone foresees coming up, envision, that will be shaking up the ICT or payments industry or data center industry in Indonesia over the next few years? So this is an open question to all.
Maybe I'll start, right? The trend has been clearly a move away from cash towards all forms of electronic transactions. And that's not just C2C or B2C, it's also B2B. Payment channels are being disrupted. So you will all have read various projects out of MAS Singapore to link Fast and Pay Now, for example, to our neighboring countries. The BIS, Bank for International Settlements, is launching an innovation project to link up B2B payments among wholesale banks that will to service the region. So we will see over time decreasing costs of transaction and friction, and that is perfect as we talk about recovering growth from the pandemic. Now, specific to innovations and IT, that means that certain things have to continue moving, right? We all know about our favorite super apps. Super apps are blurring the line between simple payments to banking to offering insurance products and linking up e-commerce. So those continue to evolve, and it's exciting to see where that will go. The ecosystem that develops around all these electronic transactions. As I mentioned, Indonesia's unique problem is the underbanked and underserved. So all the technologies that need to be in place to reach out to those populations, like eKYC, digital identity verification, fraud prevention, cybersecurity, those are technology parts that have to continue evolving and delivered cheap, right? Because it's a huge country with a huge population. On the other side, just pure financial solutions like micro lending, payday loans, B2B trade and invoice financing, and even social media payment channels and scan to pay. Now, the elephant in the room, which is a whole conference in itself, is what happens when we talk about blockchain technology and cryptocurrencies, but that is for a different forum, right?
Okay, thank you, Terence, for sharing your perspective. Omar, would you like to shed some light on the forecast for data centers industry?
Sure, I think, I mean, hyperscale data centers are certainly continuing, as I mentioned earlier, both from providers like ourselves as they grow and eventually enter in mass to Jakarta and then the other regions. I think multi-tenant facilities also are going to grow as well, and then also the edge, we call the edge facility or the edge data center in its truest sense. So the more smaller, self-contained data center is going to be an interesting development given Indonesia's geography, as we spoke of earlier. It's not going to be sustainable to have all the data always within a Jakarta or other large metro. Eventually, you're going to have to be closer to the millions that live further out because of the size of the country. So we see edge facilities really developing quickly over time, which will need the network and the submarine cables and the network infrastructure to keep up with that. And we saw in my presentation where I mentioned the 5G developments across 9 cities is going to be key and part of that piloting. And then sustainability, I think, is another interesting one. I think Indonesia geographically has a lot of opportunities for renewable and sustainable energies, more than other locations, arguably. So it could really position itself interestingly. And given global developments, let's all hope it does, or it's going to have to, just given the size of the population and the requirement for more digital interactions is going to need a lot of power as well. So being able to develop that sustainably is a big part of data center operators like us, but also energy companies and the government itself. So that's another area I think we'll see a lot of developments in Indonesia over the next few years.
Okay, thank you for sharing your insights. Blias, anything to add? If not, there is one more question on data protection. So just wanted to clarify whether is there a clear position on data protection in personal data protection in Indonesia? Yeah. Blias?
Oh, yes. Actually, for this, I don't have an answer for this personal data protection. Yeah.
Okay, sure. No worries. We will connect you with IPOS if required. Samuel, if you are interested to find out more. Yeah. All right. So I think we have no more questions. Okay, maybe I can ask one more question regarding to the current, COVID situation. Just now you did mention a little bit about the cultural aspects, right, Blias, regarding Indonesians' acceptance towards virtual business making. So do you foresee that businesses still can close deals from Singapore without meeting with the Indonesian counterparts physically?
Yeah, so actually, honestly, it's also quite challenging as well, because I've also facilitated quite a number of virtual meetings also. And actually what we observe usually during the virtual meeting, I think like what I mentioned about having that personal touch or connection is usually lacking. And it actually requires quite a strong amount of follow-up. So we actually have seen some companies actually having very good practices. So for instance, they might actually want to arrange for very prompt subsequent follow-ups. I think just using their, using maybe your Google Meet or Zoom, that is actually one way. And then if they actually have a product itself, they will usually send the item across also. So I mean, all these things are just small things that that will actually add up over time. And what they actually, a lot of companies intend to do is that once the borders actually reopen, they will actually meet them in person. But I think in any case, I think if you actually need, I think more ground assistance, we're actually currently on the ground as well. So I'm also currently in Jakarta right now. So if there's any assistance you need, we can actually do some connections as well.
Okay, yeah. I guess that's all for today. I don't see any new questions coming in. So once again, thank you very much to all the panelists for your open sharing with our audience today. And audience, if you wish to be connected with any of the speakers, do reach out to me. I'll be pasting my my blog once again inside the group chat. So if you would like to reach out to the panelists, you can just contact me. Yeah. Okay, and last of all, let's take a group photo for the panelists. Sorry, I forgot to take this earlier. Okay, everyone smile. Give me a moment. Okay, smile. Sorry, the chat keeps popping up. Okay, smile. Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone. And hope to see the audience tomorrow again at our session on the tax and legal regime. And also we'll be touching on the smart city landscape in Jakarta. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Bye.